Hello, I'm Bruce Zimmerman, and this is the Open Line Garden Show podcast for this week. Now, this week we were invited to the Vineland Innovation and Research Center to view the breeding program for greenhouse tomatoes. Now, the greenhouse tomatoes are a huge industry for Canada, that it rivals the automotive sector for Canada, and in its exports just to the United States. So it is very, very important. There's over 1 million acres under glass in Canada growing crops to be exported, as well as used locally. Now, they're doing and trying to breed tomatoes that can be used in the greenhouse in Ontario, because our Ontario days, humidity, etc., and weather is not the same as that of the tomato varieties, let's say, that are grown in Holland or even in British Columbia. So they're growing these in these greenhouses at Vineland to make sure that they could breed the perfect tomato for the market. Now, this means that when they're doing the breeding, they're breeding 1 for yield and 2 for flavor. So it means that it's not always going to be the most flavorful tomato, it's going to be the one that produces the highest yields. Now, these ones that we saw were grown hydroponically. They were used to go and see which ones will work the best and breed them successively into the best tomatoes. Now, that means that they have to be acceptable to the light, the shading, and, of course, the hydroponic solutions. So each time they are bred, they are tested, and only the best are actually crossed with each other to give us the best of the best to continue the breeding program. They've been working on this for a number of years. It usually takes about 10 years just to do the breeding, never mind any of the other production of seed, etc., for the greenhouse industry and get it distributed out to the market. So part of the testing is also that there is a certain content in the hydroponic solution so that the result of the tomato when they do the testing is consistent. And very often that means that they are weekly trying to test the liquid content of the hydroponic solution. Now they also go and try and produce the same volatiles that are in the tomato and increase those that, of course, appeal to the public, and this is important. Now, the varieties that are being bred, they started with 56 of the best, and those ones were, of course, bred as F1 hybrids with both parents to produce even better. And slowly they have been doing that. They also have trained tasters, and they have tasted the tomatoes and given their opinions. Now, it's just not opinions, but they have to actually follow some exacting rules. And while they tested and trained these testers, it came down to there were 19 successful applicants to do the testing out of 56. So they did it, and they have done it, and they are using these people to help produce a tomato that is the best tasting for the greenhouse market, particularly that in the United States and Canada. The tomatoes that are grown in Ontario are tasted for the viscosity, which is the gel and the texture inside. They are tested for firmness. They want to test for bitterness. If the taste of the tomato is grassy or more like hay, is it sweet? Is the skin tough enough or thin enough or too tough? And there's a few others in there as well, such as juicy. It's got to be, well, does it have to be juicy? To a certain extent, yes. So, all the way through, there has to be excellent tasting, breeding, in order to produce the best of the greenhouse tomatoes. Now, there is another whole set of parameters. One, they have to be red tomatoes. Two, they have to be in clusters. And they want clusters of 5 tomatoes of about 150 grams each. They have to be slightly flattened so that the cluster will actually lay flat so that it's easier to box and ship, and therefore cheaper to do those things as well. So in all of this, there is a lot to be considered. Now, in the greenhouses, we saw some tomatoes that had been, well, the hydroponic solution was off a little bit, and they were chlorotic. And you could see where it had gone and been corrected, but also you could still see the effects of the wrong amount of nutrients in the hydroponic solution. So it was going to still give us tasting tomatoes because, of course, the problem had been corrected. When they're doing the testing, they have to cleanse their palate, and I thought this was interesting. Yes, they do get plain ordinary crackers, right? But what cleans the palate the best between tastings is not water, but sparkling water. It actually was better. So when you're tasting wine, they give you bread and water, but when they're tasting tomatoes, the water has to be a sparkling water and the crackers plain, just to cleanse the palate properly to get a good taste on each of the different strains of tomatoes. So it was really interesting. We had a lot of good times. We realized that the tomato is a very complex fruit and that it has 400 volatiles. Now, what a volatile is the sense of smell, etc., and all the different chemicals that make up the taste, the smell, and the look of the tomato. So that what you taste are those 400. So the breeding program has to sort of mimic some of those. The overall effect that we had on the group was that when they finish their breeding, they will have a cluster of tomatoes that lays flat. That's about 150 grams. In fact, they're basically there now. And that they all ripen fairly red all together. So they're easier to harvest, easier to ship and box, etc. But when we tasted them, we still felt that they were greenhouse tomatoes and not those from our gardens. So I don't think you'll ever get away with not growing tomatoes in your garden or taking and buying field-grown tomatoes, because I think the overall taste and your favorite varieties are not going to be represented in the greenhouse varieties. So, do we think that it'll ever happen? No, they're going to come close and give you the best greenhouse tomatoes that you can buy. But they are not those that you go out to the garden, pick fresh, and eat. And of course, you only grow the tomato that has the best of those 400 volatiles that you like. Maybe you like your tomatoes a little more bitter, maybe a little sweeter, a little redder, a little bigger, a little more yellow, okay? Or even the cherry tomatoes, which in many cases is super sweet. So, of all of those, you're going to not see those growing in the greenhouse for export as well. So you'll never stop growing your own great tomatoes in your garden. I'm Bruce Zimmerman. This is the Open Line Garden Show podcast for this week.